Republican Senator JD Vance appeared on State of the Union with Jake Tapper, and they discussed a bunch of different things. I want to focus in on a particular talking point we've heard a lot from MAGA, which is that essentially any conflict going on around the world wouldn't have happened if Trump were still president. And this particularly is focused on Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The topic of Trump's admiration for Putin comes up, and Vance tries to frame that as this strategic, high-minded way of preventing conflicts like the invasion going on right now by Russia of Ukraine. And I have a lot to say on this. Really excited to see finally Jake Tapper dropping the truth that is necessary when the subject comes up to JD Vance. So here's this, then I'll respond.
Trump or Donald Trump loves Putin is absolutely absurd. Putin was actually pretty well behaved during the Trump administration. He invaded another country during the Biden administration. So for these guys to say that Putin prefers Donald Trump is completely ignores the underlying realities on the ground here. We actually had some real security deterrence when Donald Trump was president. And of course, it's not just in Ukraine. So again, what Fetterman's saying is preposterous.
I'm going to really quickly pause your viewing of this video to ask you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button plus the like button as well and the alert bell so you get notifications. Back to it.
Reality shows Putin didn't like when Donald Trump was president and was a lot better behaved. And I think to accuse Donald Trump of being pro-Putin completely ignores the reality on the ground.
Well, what Fetterman might say were he here is that Putin was getting a lot of things that he wanted out of Donald Trump, so he didn't need to be as hostile. Donald Trump was clearly more friendly to him than other presidents have been, one way or the other, but also Donald Trump was more hostile to NATO.
Yes, it's a great point being made from Jake Tapper. We'll get back to that one in just a little bit. But first, it needs to be said, he's sort of trying to do JD Vance, that is, the rewriting of history that we see a lot when people talk about Trump's presidency. And that's done on a lot of different fronts. Here, it's sort of on the foreign policy, world peace front. And what's being asserted is that Trump could prevent all of what's taking place in the world right now. And he did achieve world peace while he was president. Things were great. And I think, especially what we're talking about, which we'll stay focused on since it was the subject of this conversation, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that ignores so much important context. And if Trump was doing a really good job of preventing Putin's aggression and potential further aggression, then we wouldn't have seen some of the things happening while Trump was president that we did. What I mean is, very prominently, right before Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin recognized, I think is the word that's used, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as independent breakaway regions. And I think the People's Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk referred to as the Donbas region. And this is a place that for years, all the way since 2014, there's been military conflict in between Ukrainian forces and between Russian-backed separatists. And so the Russian-backed separatists have control over parts of these regions. Ukrainian forces have had control over parts, and they've been in conflict. Thousands of soldiers dying over the years, including during Trump's presidency. And so as this was going on, this is sort of a part of the broader story. And as you watch it go along, it eventually gets to, again, Putin saying, we recognize these to be independent regions. Then those are the first places that get invaded and occupied, and to this day are occupied by Russian forces. So there was this long plan being executed, it seems, from Putin, and that included while Trump was president. So he wasn't preventing what ended up being this invasion. But even setting that aside, I've said before, I find it to be a strange way to analyze world conflicts, to just go, U.S. president. Must have been because the U.S. president was strong or weak. Because there's so many complex variables, as I'm sure we all understand. And so when we look at judging the U.S. president, it's what was under the control, and then based on what they did have control over, how did they act, and they act correctly. And so when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Biden's response to it and attempted prevention, the way that he attempted to sound the alarms and prepare before Russia invaded Ukraine was correct. A bunch of people were accusing Biden of being a warmonger, and you're just hoping because the military industrial complex or something that Russia will invade, and you don't actually have good intel that they're going to. And then Russia did invade very quickly after that warning was sent out, and U.S. intelligence was correct. And because of the prompt response from the Biden administration in uniting the allies across the world and supporting Ukraine, a lot of experts will say that helped Ukraine to respond so quickly and so aggressively and successfully as they've been able to stand super strong, stronger than I think almost anyone predicted. Lots of people thought Russia could just take over the entire country in a couple of weeks. And so that was the attempted prevention and then beginning of the response. And since then, the correct thing to do is to use the US's influence to get support to Ukraine through ourselves and through our allies. And that's what Biden's been doing. So then that's what he has control over. That's what he's been doing. It seems like he's been doing the correct thing. And these more vague arguments that, no, but just things generally that happen bad in the world have to be because the US president is, it has never landed rational in my mind, as I've mentioned to you all in the past. And again, it seems to ignore the broader history and the build up and the previous conflict that ended up being connected to what's going on now, that was going on in Trump. So just a bunch of things to throw at you there. But then the most important thing, as Jake Tapper brought up, is let's even say, we don't know this, but let's say that Putin was ready to invade. He wasn't executing a longer plan that included the things he did leading up to, through Trump's administration, into Biden's administration, eventually an invasion, which probably was something he planned for a while because it takes a while to plan. But let's say that he was ready to invade and he just didn't because Trump was president. Let's just assume that. The only reason I can think of, as I've told you all before, as to why Putin would do that is not because Trump's big and bad and strong, and we'll address that talking point a little bit later, but because Trump was doing the things that Putin wanted to see done when it comes to the US and its relationships with our allies. And before I say more on that, here's a little op-ed from MSNBC, an excerpt from it. Putin wanted to undermine the NATO alliance, and Trump undermined the NATO alliance. Putin wanted to weaken the EU, and Trump made little effort to express disdain for the EU. Putin wanted to weaken the US political system, and Trump was unnervingly aggressive in trying to weaken the US political system. Putin wanted to hurt Ukraine. Trump launched an extortion scheme that threatened to hurt Ukraine. Why didn't the Russian leader deploy troops into Ukraine during Trump's term? Perhaps because Putin was so pleased with an American president who pursued goals in line with Moscow's agenda. Had Putin launched an invasion, it risked upsetting the course he was already delighted to see. Why would the Russian leader get in the way of the progress Trump was already delivering? And that's so spot on. So MAGA, you can make the argument that the timing of this invasion was impacted by who the US president was, even that actively Putin decided not to invade while Trump was president because he was president. And I'm finding myself sort of convinced by that argument. It just so happens to not portray Trump in a positive light at all, because the plausible reason that Putin would have done that is he was observing what we were. Trump reportedly considering getting us out of NATO, and the open undermining of these long-standing relationships with our allies, the very relationships that would be necessary in supporting Ukraine amid a potential invasion. And so actually going forward with that invasion while Trump was president could have risked, as the article said, messing that up. And maybe that would force Trump into a more pro-Western alliance posture. And so instead, just allowing this to play out, allowing these relationships to unravel, allowing Trump to humiliate the United States on the world stage, that benefited Putin the most. And he still, as I said earlier, was stoking conflict, but not a full-scale invasion. And then Trump was also undermining, as the excerpt I read to you from this article pointed out, the US political system. And nothing exemplifies that more than him trying to block the peaceful transfer of power. If more of those schemes had gone a little further, and for example, the fake elector scheme, if Pence had gone along with that, we don't know how that would have ended, because those were fraudulent electors that Trump was trying to get Pence to say were the real ones, and we're going to certify these. How would that have, that's a constitutional crisis. And Trump was considering and got talked out of through the threat of mass resignations among people in his administration who won't be there next time, got talked out of invoking martial law, and through the military being deployed, trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power and ordering a new election with the military. All these things being considered. If Trump had a little bit more loyalists going along with these things, we would have been, as a country, in such a weak, unstable, constitutional crisis, disaster type of moment. That's really good for Putin. So allowing that to happen And then after the most amount of damage was done, going forward with an invasion, makes some sense that he would time it that way. And so it's an interesting thought experiment. We don't know what the reasoning is, but it definitely doesn't seem to be something that proves how big and strong Trump is. And that gets me to addressing that talking point. Well, how do you know it wasn't just because everyone's so scared of Trump? Well, this is a little bit of a contradictory argument I hear from people about Trump and about Biden, which is that Biden is a warmonger and he's trying to start World War III. You hear this constantly. Tucker Carlson is always saying, oh, he's trying to start World War III. And Trump's constantly saying, yeah, Biden's going to start World War III. And I guess that's because Biden's going to be overly aggressive. But if you're saying Biden's willing to be too aggressive and start a nuclear war, then what is it that Trump would have done that would have been so strong that it would have scared? Or what was Putin scared of Trump doing that Biden wouldn't do? But aren't you saying that Biden's too willing to do too much? But Trump was so scary that he would have done even more than that. But that's not bad? Because what are you referencing? Trump was going to nuke them? Is that what you want? Nuclear war? I just don't think those arguments actually go together. Either you're saying that Trump would have done even more in terms of military action and would have gotten us directly involved in a war with Russia. And that's why Putin was like, I'm not going to do this. But then you would be rooting on Biden doing the same, which a lot of people are pretending like he's trying to get us into a military conflict with Russia when he's not. So they're criticizing him from both sides. I think in reality, there are a bunch of complex factors that contributed to why this happened when it did. Maybe some of it had to do with what we just talked about, and some of it not. And pretending like it's because the Orange Man was just so frightening, and the fact that he was so against nuclear war but also threatening it so perfectly freaked out Putin. He just said, I can't do it. Doesn't seem logical. Now, one other thing, Newsweek reports, I wanted to add this. Trump hailed as destroyer of America on Russian state TV. And the quotes are, and it will be destroyed, from one of the people who needs it, referring to Ukraine. Who needs Ukraine where they don't respect Russians? And then the other person responds, Trump is coming. Think of him as you will. I always saw him and still see him as a destroyer of America. So just know, whatever this means to you, that Russian state TV is rooting on Trump getting into power again because they believe him to be the destroyer of America. And that benefits them in their mind. Crazy stuff. Let me know what you thought of all that in the comments.